It's my great pleasure to be here to talk to you in honor of Professor López-Ibor, Juan was a good friend of mine, and of course he was a very, very well-known professor of psychiatry all over the world and involved in all things all over the world related to psychiatry. He was not only a good friend of mine, but also a good friend of German psychiatry. He could speak very well German, and I liked especially his broad spectrum approach, including not only science, but also culture as a very important backbone of psychiatry. And then I liked his lectures on psychosomatics, which were full on wonderful pictures of our wonderful European tradition. But many people do not know so good that he was also a psychopharmacologist, and he invented more or less the antidepressants as the standard treatment, drug treatment for obsessional compulsional disorders. And I think this was a very important achievement in a time when, for example, in German psychiatry, the OCD was seen as neurosis and, of course, only needed psychotherapy. So to make sure that also drug treatment is meaningful was a very big achievement. So having said this, I think it's very adequate to talk about psychopharmacology and its developments. And I have chosen the topic of the antipsychotics. Of course, I could have taken the antidepressants as topic. More or less, it would come to similar conclusions, similar strategies of development, and of course similar problems and limitations. I want to say this already in the beginning, although there is so many activity in this field, we are on the other side in a crisis of psychopharmacology. Let me shortly start with the evolution and clinical differentiation of antipsychotics. Those who are working in the field, they know this very well, how the antipsychotic drugs developed since midst of the last century. And it was the first generation of antipsychotics, starting with chlorpromazine and haloperidol later on, and so on. And in the 90s, then there was time of the second generation antipsychotics, which tried to mirror clozapine, especially, which they unfortunately never realized in full extent. And in the recent decade, we had some other developments in this field. Most of these compounds followed the strategy of the second generation antipsychotics, so developing a broad spectrum approach to psychosis, but without having the limitations of severe extrapyramidal side effects in special. And especially in the last years, also the focus was on the development of depot neuroleptics, of the second generation antipsychotics, and interestingly, not only focusing on compounds with a 2 or 4 week injection interval, but even going up to a 3 months interval with paliperidone palmitate. I think that's very interesting. In times of evidence-based medicine, we are always focused with the evidence. That means if we put all the data from randomized control group studies together, what is then the advantage of the so-called newer generation of antipsychotics? And you see here the famous meta-analysis of Leucht showing some, let me say, advantages, for example, for especially in depression and in negative symptoms for some of these compounds, clozapine, olanzapine, and some others. I will not go into the detail here, but we could also say, and that is the position of those who are more critically than me, they say, no, yeah, there's not so much difference. And on the other side, there was the high cost of this newer generation of antipsychotics, which is and was a problem. Nowadays, most of these compounds are generic, and that means also the price has gone down. And if we see a very recent meta-analysis of the same author, he is from Munich, in Lancet, then we see and now he is focusing on the total score of PANSS or BPRS, then you see the differences between the compounds when we look into the placebo-verum difference is not as big, only clozapine is an outlier in the best sense. That means it's the strongest compound, but this leads already also to a clinical question and problem. Clozapine has severe side effects, especially the very seldom risk of agranulocytosis, and due to this, it cannot be the compound of first rank. It is second rank, so mostly for patients with refractory illness. But this leads to another problem. Nowadays, with this focus on evidence-based medicine, we forget very often that the meta-analysis of data and the results of these data, which are coming primarily from RCTs on very, very selected populations, should not be over-determining our clinical attitude. And we should not forget that besides this, there is the world and experience of clinicians, which probably very often come to other results than meta-analysis. And in this context, I would like to mention this quotation of Sackett. He is one of the fathers of evidence-based medicine, and of course, he focused first on evidence in this British sense, that means based on randomized control group studies, and forgetting clinical evidence because it's subjective. But on the other side, he underlies that it is very important to include this, let me say, objective evidence into the clinical experience and to combine these tools. And that's very important because if you don't do this, you, in the current state of knowledge, you never will be able to do an individualized treatment. And going beyond this, so all these meta-analyses do not look for neurobiological differences, of course. That is not their scope. But if we go on this level, we find easily that between all this compound, which we have seen before as being more or less equally in efficacy, at least if we look into global efficacy, have a lot of differences. And I will start with this study from Lieberman, which I love very much. It's a landmark study from my viewpoint. He described that there, in this control group study between alloperidol and olanzapine and healthy controls, and they made repetitious MRI, structural MRI measurements, and they demonstrated very nicely that with olanzapine, there was nearly no change of the brain in this chart here, gray volume, but with haloperidol, there was a reduction of gray matter volume. I think a very nice empirical study demonstrating that although these two compounds are more or less the same in their antipsychotic efficacy, but if we go to the neurobiological level, they have differences. And there are good reasons for these differences, which can be demonstrated by a lot of animal research that, for example, olanzapine leads and not haloperidol leads to is increase of neurotrophic factors, increased neurogenesis, prevention of cell death in the related and respective animal studies. Let me go to another area. This is functional MRI. This is a study we performed in 12 patients. I demonstrate here only one individual patient. He was treated, of course, schizophrenia patient, treated with quetiapine in this case, and he was measured, he was scanned before treatment and after the 12-week treatment, and we applied for the functional MRI treatment a certain working memory paradigm, and we could demonstrate that before there was nothing, no activity in the brain demonstrating the working memory process, but after 12 weeks of treatment, you see here in different parts of the brain, it's midfrontal gyrus, Brodmann area 9, that there is activation. Apparently, the treatment with quetiapine was able to restore, to reactivate the information processing in the brain. And we could demonstrate this also in a huge group study with about 45 patients, schizophrenia, where we again demonstrated between quetiapine and other second-generation antipsychotics and first-generation antipsychotics, in this case mostly haloperidol, great difference in functional MRI in such a working memory paradigm. So if we look on such a level, we find differences, and I think we should not stop with the clinical level, but we should go into these neurobiological levels to find new ways to develop, hopefully, new compounds. Another level, it's also from my group, and using a stem cell paradigm, we compared ziprasidone, also second-generation antipsychotic, with haloperidol, and measured the de novo neurogenesis of adult neuronal stem cells derived from the mouse hippocampus, and we could demonstrate that ziprasidone, but not haloperidol, induced de novo neurogenesis in this model. So again, I think very interesting data. But we have also to say that in the recent past, especially starting with a study from the group of Andreasen, it was recognized that neuroleptics can also induce brain volume reductions. And this is, of course, let me say, inducing concerns. But if you look into the data of other groups and trying to find a way out of this dilemma, it looks like that only the traditional antipsychotics lead probably to this brain volume reduction in a subgroup of patients with poor outcome, but not second-generation antipsychotics. I have no time to go into this here in detail, but I think this is a very important statement. Let's now look into the current drug development, and also shortly will mention some special activities in drug treatment in schizophrenia, the co-medication treatment activities, because they probably also give a hint into the future that we don't look only into the magic bullet, which in the sense that one compound can treat the whole spectrum of psychotic symptoms, positive symptoms, negative symptoms, depressive symptoms, and so on. But probably we have to develop combination therapies. Let me start with this review, which I published 2000 12, I think the first point is that current drug development is still based on the classical transmitter approaches. So let me say dopamine especially, and nowadays in the more recent time, glutamatergic and other transmitter approaches. But we will also go into, hopefully, in totally new directions based on genetic findings, and probably also go into other models of developing the compounds who are used for treating schizophrenia. So not always looking into the symptoms, but also look into other aspects. And there are groups which suggest very strongly that we should focus much more on the development of those compounds who are changing brain plasticity. I think that is very interesting. And a more general point is, which I already mentioned, is the question whether, besides the classical concept of antipsychotic, which covers all symptom domains of schizophrenia, there is place for a one syndrome concept. So let me say only covering or focusing on negative symptoms. And that leads, of course, to the question if they only cover negative symptoms. But many patients has, of course, also at least to a certain degree positive symptoms, and that means then co-medication therapy, let me say, with a more or less classical antipsychotic and one of these new compounds which are only, let me say, compounds focusing or treating negative symptoms. This is taken from a publication from Lopez Muniz and Alamo. It shows that there are several activities in the field focusing on the different transmitters, especially still dopaminergic transmitters, but also serotonergic compounds, and very often we have the combination of both, which we know already from the so-called second-generation antipsychotics. It goes on here, and then there's also appearance of new developments focusing on the glutamatergic receptor, but even GABA receptors, and so on and so on. I have no time to go into this in details. So there are strong beliefs that on the if we really want to go into new directions, that other transmitters should have taken into account, especially the glutamatergic symptoms, but also other transmitters are of interest, like in the recent years, the acetylcholine receptors and other receptors. So I will focus here on the glutamate system because this had induced most relevant productivity in this field and creativity in this field. And there are many models and also clinical experience with phencyclidine and other NMDA receptor antagonists that apparently glutamate plays a role in the etiopathogenesis of schizophrenia, and that intervention in the glutamatergic system might be helpful and might lead to a new direction of antipsychotic compounds. And this graph shows you in principle what kind of interventions are possible. I will only stick to one part of this graph here, so we'll forget the AMPA receptor intervention. So we have the possibility to intervene with inhibitors of the glycine transporter. The most famous of this compound is bitopertin. I will mention this later. And another type of intervention is to use modulators of the glutamate metabotropic receptors. I will also give you later on an example. This is a bitopertin developed by company Roche, and they demonstrated very nicely in this pilot study that there was a clear advantage of bitopertin versus placebo in the 10 milligram and 30 milligram dose range in negative symptoms. And this was a very, very exciting finding in the recent years. And of course, company people dreamed already that they had a new blockbuster. And they also hired staff to develop this further. But unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, not so much for the company, it's also, of course, not nice for them, but unfortunately for our field, for the patients, the 2 phase 3 studies were not positive, and Roche decided not to develop this further. And the same happened to this Lilly compound, a selective agonist for the mGlu1 and 3 receptor. This Lilly compound also demonstrated in the first clinical study very good results, both in terms of positive and negative symptoms, but later on the phase 3 studies were not positive. And again, a great disaster for the company, great disaster for our field. There were some approaches also in the cholinergic system, because there were was a finding in the genetic findings that the alpha-7 receptor is alterated in schizophrenia, and so there were several developments in this field. So far, this is inconclusive. There's also a strong signal from the genetic research, but also from classical neurobiologic research before that, immunological mechanism might play a role in schizophrenia, and therefore, especially also in our department, my colleague Norbert Müller was deeply involved in this, and we performed a study with the COX-2 inhibitor, celecoxib, and could demonstrate as an add-on therapy and could demonstrate a better improvement than with the monotherapy. And there were also findings from other groups, among other very interesting from a group from Iran, which supported our findings. So there is something, and this must be developed further, I think. Now we are already on the level of combination treatment, and then we have to look for a short moment also into the field of treatment of negative symptoms of schizophrenia, which are difficult to treat, as we all know. That in this field, combination treatment is very common, especially combination treatment with antidepressants, and there's a nice review from 2010 demonstrating that indeed this add-on treatment is meaningful in treating negative symptoms. And there's another one which focused more on specific antidepressants like mianzarine and mirtazapine, who are in their core mechanism of action alpha-2 presynaptic antagonists. And they demonstrated in this review that this mode of action is very helpful, again, in co-medication with antipsychotics to treat negative symptoms. This is a recent review which I wrote and published in European Psychiatry, and there you find all these details on the treatment of negative symptoms. We also demonstrated, published here with my co-worker Junio, that it might be of great importance that we look into the interplay between glutamatergic neurotransmission and neural proliferation, and we started to demonstrate some animal models in this respect. And this leads finally to this publication from Terry, who suggests very intensively that neurodevelopmental models should be taken into account much more when we develop new antipsychotics. Now I come to genetic impact on drug development. I think something was already related to this, but of course we can confer this a bit further. So there are a lot of data now about gene alteration in schizophrenia, especially recently the GWAS study, the genome-wide association studies, brought a new group of gene loci being alterated in schizophrenia, and altogether currently in the GWAS studies we overlook about 108 of these genetic variations, genetic loci, and these were put together in a nice publication, Nature Neuroscience, into 3, let me say, different mode of action where they are related to. This is on the one side, of course, the synapses, the receptors. On the other side, it's immune, the histopathology, very important, and the histone methylation demonstrating, let me say, a connection with epigenetics, so very important too. And of course, there's hope that based on all these new findings, where the new biological mechanism of these different gene alterations has to be studied much further, there's hope that we can avoid this long process, or that we have already something in between by targeting these gene alterations in a, as the author called it here, Lenz and Malhotra, as a fast-track strategy. So what does he mean with this? He says we know that some of these gene alterations and these target regions are associated already with compounds which are huge in internal medicine, for example. For example, you see here as a strong field the calcium channels. And of course, there are compounds already available in internal medicine focusing or targeting these channels, these calcium channels. And there are other compounds also related to drugs under developing. So we have already an armamentarium which we could use to tackle these genetically decided targets. And there are now some movements in this direction. For example, there are already few of these studies where they used calcium channel blockers in the treatment of schizophrenia as co-medication, as an add-on therapy, with, I have to say, different results, so it's not conclusive. And of course, we can go further in this genetic-based approach and can select target and could again look whether we have compounds available already or whether we can develop new compounds. So we also perform a study with a calcium blocker, but now we perform also a study with another compound used in in internal medicine, and this is related to the findings that neuroregulin gene is alterated in schizophrenia. And the neuroregulin, if we go further with this, I will avoid all the details, is also connected with another factor, the ERBB4 factor. And this, I make it short now, can be targeted with, with spironolactone. You know, it's a mineral corticoid receptor inhibitor, but also an ERBB4 inhibitor, and therefore we will use it in a controlled, as a randomized control group study in schizophrenia. Let me say a few words of the current crisis of drug development and pharmaceutical industry. What I demonstrated here sounds very positive, but unfortunately it is not so positive because pharmaceutical companies understand the business in psychiatry and neuroscience not anymore as attractive. And this has to do with the fact that it's very difficult to bring a psychopharmacological agent on the market. Let me say, the efficacy rate is much lower than they are, that they know it in the field of internal medicine, for example. So there's a high risk that you cannot bring anything on the market. And you know, for example, especially in the field where we thought this is a new biologically mostly advanced field, Alzheimer. The molecular biology of Alzheimer is nicely detected and described, and there were wonderful ways to reduce, hypothetical ways, to reduce the amyloid loading, and all these strategies, including the immunization, was not successful. So great disappointment, and this leads to the point that many companies lose, or that we lose many companies to sand. In these terms, many of the companies don't work anymore in CNS, and of course this is a horrible scenario. And I was on a certain meeting with, let me say, excellent basis researchers, clinicians, and also people from drug companies, and also bank people. And there was a young banker, a very smart guy, and he said, "Oh, I say to my clients, if you want to burn money, then spend it for neuroscience." This was harsh, but it describes the situation. When I was president of CMP, we had several so-called think tank meetings where we tried to overcome these problems, and where we also invited pharmaceutical industry, and this was published in several papers. And there was also a summit meeting where we really came together with the industry and with bank people, and this is also published. And you find there the arguments from the different sides, also very critical arguments about psychiatry. And of course, it does not look nice when we say, oh, we have a treatment for depression, and we want to develop new treatment for depression. But other people say, what is the inter-rater reliability to make the diagnosis of depression? Okay, I say, it's not very good. With DSM-5, it's only a kappa of 0.3. That is nearly close to chance. Of course, this is shocking. So clinical psychiatry has to overcome many, many problems, and DSM-5 is, of course, not the solution. This is a very nice paper. It's mentioned in my publication, which is in this fat book, which we celebrate today too. Of course, you cannot read this. You should only read the title. Very nice, and they go in many, many details. Also, this is not for reading. You have to look into this. And in my paper published in this fat book, I referred to some of the suggestions. What to make it not too depressive, I think it's also very important that we can also be very proud. The efficacy of our drug treatment in depression and schizophrenia and so on, which is often accused as not to be of clinical relevance, is, as we see here, on the level of general medicine drugs. This is taken from a study from meta-analysis from Leucht, and I think this is something we should always show in our presentations, especially if we present in situations where we have also our colleagues from general practice or internal medicine. Because you gave a presentation on stigma, I think this continuous debate about the sufficient or not sufficient efficacy of our psychopharmacological compound is also one of stigmatizing psychiatry. I think my time is over. Is this right, Mr. Chairman, or no?
You have 15 minutes.
30 minutes? Oh, then I can go on, because the last part is also where, you know, I'm German, we are very strict with time always. We are the so-called anankastic nation when it comes to time. Huh? So, towards new nomenclature of psychopharmaca. I mentioned the term second generation antipsychotics, and of course that means there's a first generation antipsychotics, and this was, or we have atypical antipsychotics. All these terms were also criticized by some people who are, let me say, very serious about this, that these are more or less marketing terms and not scientific terms. And indeed, this is not totally wrong, probably, and we should try to develop better terms. There's also another problem with our psychopharmacological terminology, that is that we are sometimes apparently confused, or we probably not, but the patients, our patients are confused when they prescribe them, when they have a when they present with an anxiety disorder, that we prescribe them antidepressants. We prescribe them for OCD, following Lopez-Ibor, and antidepressants, and of course nowadays serotonin reuptake inhibitors. But if the patient read antidepressants, they are totally shocked. Doctor, I don't have a depression. You never told me that I have a depression. Why you prescribe me something like this? I have OCD or have anxiety disorder, general anxiety disorder, whatever. And then here's the next problem. We prescribe sometimes for patients who have depression and antipsychotic, especially the so-called second generation antipsychotic. And again, the patient is shocked. So he comes nervously back to me and says, Professor, what did you prescribe me? I have read this. This is something for schizophrenia. Do I have schizophrenia? Now I say, you don't have schizophrenia. We mostly do not use the term schizophrenia anymore. We say psychosis, but you also do not have psychosis. So I clarify that these are indications for these compounds, but we use these compounds also in other indications, especially as co-medications. So, and having said all this, there is a problem with nomenclature, and therefore the two most important, or four most important society for psychopharmacology, International Society for Psychopharmacology, that is ECMP, CRNP, ASCMP, the Asian one, and of course the American one, the ACMP. So always the most important because highest scientific, especially with the new development, decided to develop a new nomenclature. And you see, I also was involved in this. My part was due to my position in CMP as president and past president. It took several years, but finally we made it. It was not easy. And we developed this book, but this book is not up to date anymore. So I suggest this app, which especially young people like to do, and it gives also more freedom of connecting all the different categories and so on. So it's very helpful to play with the app. And so I will not go into the details, but I will describe you again only the problem. This is risperidone, one of the so-called second-generation antipsychotics. These are these wonderful cartoons by Professor Stahl, who is so creative to develop this. So this is a second-generation antipsychotic. Very nice with all the details of the receptor profiles and binding intensities. And here we have quetiapine. Looks totally otherwise. Risperidone, more or less selective, focusing especially on D2 and to a certain degree 5-HT2A. But you see here quetiapine, much broader spectrum of activities, pharmacological efficacies. And although the most important in terms of intensity of the binding is D2 and 5-HT2A, but especially very important is that there is also noradrenaline reuptake inhibition, the inhibition of the reuptake inhibitor, which is currently understood as the core pharmacology component or mechanism of antidepressants. So these compounds are highly different, and to say these are second-generation antipsychotics is, of course, pharmacologically totally unprecise and not satisfying. And I know many psychiatrists saying, oh, I was born with haloperidol and I still use haloperidol and I will never change my attitude. And I say, okay, I was not born with haloperidol. I started psychiatry in 1971, but that means also quite a long time. And I'm very conservative always. But I adapted in a certain way to the new time because some of the new compounds were very interestingly I liked, that we did not see anymore these patients on the ward, the haloperidol-induced extrapyramidal symptoms. I was angry with my young doctors if some of our patients looked like this, and I said to him, that is not acceptable anymore. Either you use very, very low dose treatment with haloperidol, this is sufficient, okay, but if not, take another compound to avoid these horrible and stigmatizing side effects. So, and then he comes up with many other ideas, this critical colleague, but I say to him, come, let's look to this chart here. Do you think that antipsychotics can be antidepressive? No, haloperidol is not antidepressant. No. Okay, you are right. But there are other compounds which has a very rich spectrum of pharmacological interactions at the different receptor sites. And I will tell you now in a very theoretical 1-hour discussion why this helps to develop antidepressive efficacy. So we can have an alpha-2 antagonism. Many of the second-generation antipsychotics, especially also clozapine, have alpha-2 antagonists, also iloperidone and others. Also azenapine, which, by the way, was developed coming from mirtazapine. So one part of the azenapine structural formula is belonging to mirtazapine, and this includes the alpha-2 receptor antagonism. Then there's norepinephrine transporter antagonism, but we have also 5-HT2A antagonism, and this is also related to antidepressive properties. We have also, which is unfortunately not demonstrated here, a 5-HT2-1 agonism, which is also connected with antidepressive effects, and we have low D2 receptor occupancies, which can also be associated with antidepressants. So these compounds with such a huge spectrum of pharmacological actions is really something other than haloperidol, and we must learn as clinicians with our clinical experience to develop this further, to describe this further. By the way, the clinicians found very early that quetiapine is antidepressive, so it was not primarily the idea of the company. And then, of course, we have to test this clinical hypothesis in new studies following the modern clinical standards. So, and that's how it looks now in our nomenclature textbook, ABM, also neuroscience-based text nomenclature on psychopharmacology. And you see, sorry, this was not good. Go back, hopeful, yeah. This you see here, pharmacological target of quetiapine is primarily dopamine, but it's also multifunctional. It includes both antagonistic and agonistic properties. It's not only related to dopamine, but also serotonin is included, norepinephrine uptake inhibitor is included, and this goes further in detail here on the right side. So let me say this is a starter, and if you are becoming more interested in this, then you go into the right side and find more of this. And here are some words about efficacy and side effects, but that is only, let me say, short and not so important. But I think if you then go to this textbook and then you tackle, let me say, drugs for treatment of schizophrenia, we don't call them anymore antipsychotics because there might be other drugs and antipsychotics treating schizophrenia. Then you find a lot of the different compounds which traditionally were compound antidepressant. We avoid the term, the traditional terms, especially I can make it clear with antidepressants. Of course, we have antidepressants in the old sense, but we have more for treating depression. We have antidepressants, but we have also other compounds to treat depression in co-medication. Let me mention again quetiapine because it has the indication for this add-on treatment, but of course also aripiprazole has this and some other compounds. So we try to avoid the terms antidepressants, antipsychotics, because this might confuse the patient, and we say, I will treat you with an, it's very simple with the SSRIs, with an SSRI, because here the name means the mechanism. That's very simple. But we don't call the SSRI antidepressant anymore. Yeah, that is something terminological, I think very important, because Juan López-Ibor was also very much interested in language, in terminology, language of science, language of psychopathology, language of classification, and this is something like language of classification, of nomenclature in psychopharmacology. I think I leave out the summary. It's boring. You were so attentive that you understood all. This is Munich. It's a wonderful city near the Alps. This is the old door, the old entrance part of our hospital. The Kraepelinian Hospital was opened 1904 by Kraepelin, and it's in very good shape, as you can see here, because when I took over the chair, I was allowed, I got the money to do a very intensive renovation for 40 million of D-Mark at that time. And this is now our research institute. And this is the hospital which was built in the time of my honored predecessor, Professor Hans Jurgen. So it's a very nice place for the patient treatment. Thank you so much.